a very
Okay.
one, and then kind of hand it off.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool.
That's cool.
Thank you, everyone.
It's about you.
No, I don't.
Joining in at Zibby's Bookshop. We're here to launch Burt Kearns' book on Marlon Brando. So very excited. Thank you all for coming. This is personally a very exciting opportunity for us too. Burt is a good family friend of mine. Was a huge help when I moved out here 2 years ago. So I'm happy to return the favor and kind of help support this launch as well. But we have plenty of books to purchase, and we'll do a quick Q&A and a conversation and signing after. So enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Burt.
Shall I introduce Ray Richmond?
Oh.
Ray Richmond is the acclaimed author, writer, and critic, entertainment writer for Gold Derby right now, right?
That's right.
And you go
And
back to everywhere.
and sometime adjunct professor at Chapman University.
And a professor. I like to refer to him as the dean of Hollywood journalists.
Thank you. It's not true, but I appreciate it nonetheless.
Professor's close enough.
Well, we've been working our way through the alphabet, I guess, in pitching your book, Burt, and we finally made it to Z. Here we are at Zibby's. And so I'm Ray Richmond, and it's my honor to be here with my pal Burt Kearns about his latest masterpiece, the some sort of biography, Marlon Brando, Hollywood Rebel. And there it is. And there it is. Yeah. It's a terrific read. I highly encourage everyone to purchase it. And I have it on good authority. The author might sign it if you do. So here we are, two straight guys in a female-run bookstore talking about a man who literally defined sexual ambiguity. So the world already purportedly knew so much about Brando, Burt. The method actor, the remote, kind of eccentric personality. And why did you decide to tackle him as a subject for a book, besides the fact we're approaching the centennial of his birth?
Well, the centennial of Brando's birth was in April. And that was one reason why we did pick Marlon Brando as the subject of this book. The other reason is that I've written a few books, I've done documentaries, I've done projects, and I have a very bad habit of doing projects about people that most people have never heard of. And so talking to my agent, he said, you've got to do a book about somebody that people have heard of. So you can sell a few copies of the book. And
like Lawrence Tierney. I
did a book on Lawrence Tierney, which before a publisher finally took it was mostly, who's Lawrence Tierney? Why would you do a book on Lawrence Tierney? Yeah, he has a great story. So Marlon Brando is an actor who probably the greatest screen actor of the 20th century. There's been a lot of books on Marlon Brando. Peter Manso did one that's about 800 pages. Brando had his own book. What else could you write about Marlon Brando that people haven't looked at yet? Well, 20 years after his death, 100 years after his birth, came up with the idea of just looking at the cultural influence that Marlon Brando has today, which goes far beyond acting. It goes into from fashion to film to music to activism. It goes across the board. And most of it, I found, goes back to this film, The Wild One. 1953, it was Brando's fifth motion picture, not his best one. He had come to Hollywood in 1950 after changing the course of acting on Broadway with A Streetcar Named Desire. He was a force of nature, a kind of actor that no one had ever seen before on stage. He brought that out to Hollywood. Everybody thought that he was going to sign with a studio, get into a 3-picture deal like everybody else would do at the time. He didn't. He came out and he signed with the producer Stanley Kramer to do a film called The Men, in which Brando played a paraplegic war veteran in a VA hospital, trying to come to grips with the fact that he won't be able to satisfy his fiancée and whether he wants to live as a paraplegic. When Brando arrived in Hollywood, there was great acclaim. Here comes the brat from Broadway. Let's see what he can do in motion pictures. He didn't show up at LAX with a crowd of photographers waiting for him. He didn't get a bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel. Took a train out to the suburbs, went to his aunt's house and bunked on the couch because his grandmother had the extra bedroom. He lived there for about a week or two And then he checked himself into a VA hospital in Van Nuys and lived for a month as a paraplegic war veteran. Actors didn't do that back then. Now everybody does that sort of thing. Daniel Day-Lewis will lock himself in a closet for 6 weeks to get ready to be in a Name of the Father. But Robert De Niro will fight a middleweight boxer to get ready for Raging Bull. That all came from Brando. So Brando did The Men. After The Men, he recreated his role as Stanley Kowalski in A Streetcar Named Desire. Followed that with the revolutionary Emiliano Zapata in Viva Zapata. And then Brando, known as the mumbling actor, took on Shakespeare. He played Mark Antony in Julius Caesar and was great. He killed. Everybody said this guy is great. For those last 3 films, he had 3 Best Actor Academy Award nominations. The world was his. What could he do? Where would he go next? He decided to make a biker flick, playing the leader of a motorcycle gang. The difference was there was no such thing as a biker flick back then.
1953.
1953. This was a Stanley Kramer production. Stanley Kramer had produced The Men. He was known for doing message films. He did High Noon. Stanley Kramer was known for doing left-wing message films that really had a message and had some sort of social relevance. The Wild One was, again, it's going to be a socially relevant film. It was about World War II veterans who came back from the war. They had seen terrible things in Europe during the war they couldn't talk about. This is the greatest generation, the silent generation. And they couldn't fit back into society. They couldn't fit into the picket fence suburbs. So what do? They got Harley Davidson motorcycles, just as they had in Europe. They were making them in America again. They got on these motorcycles. They got gangs, and they took to the roads, mostly out in the West. And at the same time, there was a lot of talk in Congress and in community groups about juvenile delinquency after World War II. The mothers were working in factories, the fathers were away, the kids were growing up too fast, they were forming gangs. So this movie was supposed to tackle both those social issues. Brando wanted to do it for that reason. Brando wanted to do a movie that meant something, that would make a difference in American society. He only wanted to do movies that could do some sort of good for people. He wasn't interested in doing something like Guys and Dolls. That came later. What happened was they made the film. Brando did the role. He was into it. He added his own ideas to the film. And then the Production Code Administration, the self-censoring group from Hollywood, tore the script apart. They rejected the script. So in the end, as far as Brando was concerned, all that was left was the violence and the chaos. The story of a motorcycle gang that comes to a small town. Another motorcycle gang comes. They raise hell at night. And in the morning, the police come. Everybody goes away. Everything that Brando wanted to be said in this movie was taken out by the censors. So he was very disappointed. He walked away from the film and said, I'm never going to do something like this again. As a matter of fact, I'm leaving. I'm quitting Hollywood. I'm just going to go back to the stage, which in the end he didn't do. So Brando walks away from this film and has no idea what happened next. The kids saw this film. They saw that image of Marlon Brando on the motorcycle in the leather jacket and the sideburns. And he had Bausch and Lomb sunglasses. The kids saw that and they said that's who we want to be. And it turned out that this film launched a youth revolution, and it launched a rock and roll revolution, even though there wasn't a hint of rock and roll in the entire picture. It also happened to coincide, came out right around the same time that the Supreme Court issued its Brown versus Board of Education ruling, saying that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. The civil rights movement was just starting. In this film, Brando's group was called the Black Rebels Motorcycle Club. The town they invade is called Wrightsville. You could say it was Whitesville. This group spoke in a bebop hipster language that black jazz musicians talked in the 1940s. This helped stoke the civil rights revolution at the same time. And this was only the first few years after this picture came out. By the time Blackboard Jungle and Rebel Without a Cause came out about a year and a half later, people were pinning a lot of that on those films. But even those films were compared at the time by the critics to The Wild One. So this is a film that Brando did that's, again, not his best picture, but wound up being its most influential. It winds up influencing Elvis Presley, may have given name to the Beatles, Andy Warhol, fashion, everybody, Madonna, not counting actors. And the other thing you can say is, and this is probably the most important thing, is that without The Wild One, you wouldn't have the Leatherman from the Village People. Because that's where the image came from.
Literally, rebellion in popular culture emanated from him in this film.
Yeah.
I mean, before that, we're still coming out of the war. We're coming out of World War II. Everybody, domesticity has taken hold. And then, there's this youth culture that's angry and restless, that's bubbling underneath. And now you got him with his tight leather jacket and his biker cap, and this challenging expression. Everybody has a theory on what he was trying to convey with that expression, right? Fearlessness, vulnerability, masculinity, femininity, rebellion, fury. What do you see in that expression?
Well, that's everything that Brando wanted to bring across. They call it his bisexual charisma. And there's another reason why this film, we're heading into Pride Month tomorrow. There's another reason why this film had a great impact on gay culture and gay rights. Brando, he was bisexual. He was open about it. At a time when leading men were not, he was very open about the fact that he had sex with men, had sex with women. To him, he said, sex is sex. Sex is nothing, just, whatever. He'd do it because it made the other person happy. In this film, he had a lot of choices on how he played the leader of a motorcycle gang. Now, you can compare him to Lee Marvin. Lee Marvin appears in the film as the leader of the rival motorcycle gang. Lee Marvin is drunk. He's smoking a cigar.
Hard drinking Marine.
In real life, he was an ex-Marine. He's drunk. His gang are wearing kilts and raccoon caps, and they look very much like the motorcycle gangs looked like at that time. And most of them followed the image of Lee Marvin as opposed to Brando. Brando's group were rather fussy. They had nice leather jackets. They all had dungarees, they call them at the time. They had blue jeans that were rolled up, and they had little caps, and they were a little more military looking, but they're a little fussy. And also Brando, and now Lee Marvin playing the head of his motorcycle gang, is a tough talking guy you expect. Brando had a bit of a lisp, which he had already. He had a bit of a lisp, and he talked in a high-pitched voice. And they say that the reason he did it had to do with the censorship of the film. The film opens with a crawl saying that this is a movie about a terrible incident that happened that could never happen again in America. It just happened once, and this could never happen again. We have to make sure of it. And then the censors made Brando do an audio version. They made him speak a second disclaimer. And he was so angry about that because he said, no, this could happen anywhere. That's the whole reason we did this movie. It could happen again tomorrow. Well, he was so angry that he had to read it that he put on a fake voice because he didn't want people to know it was him. And he put on a lisping kind of high-pitched voice in the beginning of the film. Well, he kept that throughout the movie. Get into the movie now. You get into the script. Now, again, I'm not a cinema expert. I'm a journalist and pop culture writer. A lot of this was new to me. Lee Marvin comes to town. Brando's gang is already in this town. Lee Marvin's gang pulls up. And it turns out that Lee Marvin and Brando's character knew each other. They used to ride together. Well, the first thing Lee Marvin says to Brando is, Johnny, I've been looking all over for you, Johnny. I love you, Johnny. Where you been, Johnny? I missed you. I love you. He keeps telling him, I love you. I love you. I'm saying, well, that's very interesting. And Brando's like, Marvin had taken Brando's trophy off his bike. Give me back my trophy. And the next thing these two guys do is they wrestle. And they wrestle around on the ground, and they're hugging each other and wrestling. Then they get up, and Brando punches Lee Marvin. And Lee Marvin goes crashing through the plate glass window of a milliner's store. In between two mannequins, a bride and a groom. When he stands up, the bride is no longer there. Now, I don't look too deep into these. I'm saying, this looks pretty obvious here. Then when the whole subplot of the film as Brando meets a small town girl who wants to get out of the town, they have a little liaison where they're about to hook up out in the woods, and Brando like runs away from her. And she's going, "Oh, you're scared of me. Why are you scared of me? Would you rather fight me?" I was like, "Oh, this is very interesting here." And so, as it turned out, doing a little bit more research into this film, you found out that one of the issues, we're talking about these social issues that they were interested in at the time, was the fact that gangs of youth in the early 50s they were very concerned about homosexuality among the gangs. They were saying, we used to be worried about older men going after these, because now we're worried about the kids themselves. So that was another issue, another angle that Brando brought into the role through the fact that of the way he played the character and what was also written on the page there. So that had given rise to what they call the queer reading of The Wild One, which has really grown throughout the last 70 years.
And these homoerotic overtones in the film.
Yeah, they're there.
And he, didn't deny them, and in fact stoked them.
Yeah.
I guess there was a fear in America at the time that youth culture was going to turn everybody homosexual.
Yeah.
And that would be that for the birth rate.
It was part of it. Now, an interesting thing was there was an artist in Finland named Tuukko Lanasen, and he drew homoerotic art of men, and they were very soft, beautiful men in color, etc. Color pictures, very nice images. You can still see him. He's in the Museum of Modern Art. He's in museums and everywhere. After he saw The Wild One, everything changed for this artist. Every image he did now of the gay man was a guy in a black leather motorcycle jacket, tight jeans, bulging from the crotch, bulging from the muscles. And he said he did it because of The Wild One. Once he saw that image, it changed him. Now that image spread throughout the Western world. And that's where you started getting the leather culture. And it wound up replacing the stereotype of the gay man. Used to be in the 40s and the 50s, it was Franklin Pangborn, the sissy, the fairy, etc. Now suddenly it was
a lot more butch.
It was the butch, it was the leather man, which goes on, as we'll see, if you go see the Pride Parade tomorrow, you'll see a whole bunch of them marching. And that comes directly from Marlon Brando and The Wild One.
And these adolescent seeming leading men kind of followed in his wake, right? I mean, what we have today with like Timothy Chalamet and the Ryan Goslings and the Leonardo DiCaprios, maybe even the Johnny Depps, these guys all were born from Brando in this role.
Well, you look, before Brando came along, the leading men were, Gary Cooper, Clark Gable,
Steve McQueen,
Humphrey Bogart. These were macho men. They weren't crybabies. Brando, in his first film, The Men, has a big scene where he just sits and he weeps and cries. In this film, after the girl runs away from him, Brando's on his motorcycle and he cries. Leading men didn't cry, right? But there was because of this, it changed Hollywood's perception of masculinity and the leading man. You wound up having actors like James Dean in his footsteps, Paul Newman, and Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley modeled himself after Marlon Brando. I found it's mentioned in the book early on, where he is he's doing a radio interview in Texas because Heartbreak Hotel just sold 1 million copies. He's getting a gold record for it. And the guy's saying, Elvis, we're presenting you with this gold record. You've got to be so happy that you've got your first gold record. And he said, no, wait. The real thing is I just signed a deal with Paramount Pictures. It's one thing to be a singer, but if you want to be a star, you've got to be in the movies. I'm making movies. I'm going to be like Marlon Brando. I'm going to go to the actor's studio. And guess what? I'm not going to do any music in my movies. I'm just going to act. And that didn't really work out the way he planned.
But so the primary point of Beyond The Wild One, Burt, is his impact on American culture, and obviously queer culture as well, vast and enduring and still happening today. And I think a lot of the actors who are out there now, and even guys who have been around a long time like De Niro, maybe even Brad Pitt, these guys all credit Brando.
Oh yeah. I mean, the thing with Brando is, in later years, he really put down acting very publicly. He would say, acting is lying. Anybody can act. I mean, it was very easy for him. So to him, it was no big deal to act. He would rather do anything else. He would have rather been a jazz drummer. What he really was interested in was activism. And he really gave up much of his career in the 1960s for activism. He was the first one to show up at San Quentin to protest the execution of Carol Chessman. There are the Quakers, and there are the people from Berkeley, and there's all the activists. And in the middle of it, standing in a suit, is Marlon Brando addressing the crowd. He's the one who marched along with Charlton Heston and Paul Newman and James Baldwin, marched with Martin Luther King and stood behind Martin Luther King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial when he did his I Have a Dream speech. He's the one who, when he went to Tahiti, started looking at ways to, improve the environment and find, to work on ecological projects. Tahiti turned the atoll that he bought into a sort of a laboratory for that, which still exists today. When he made the film Burn, one of his best films, which a lot of people haven't seen, it was set in the 1850s. He played a British agent who goes to the Caribbean to start a rebellion among the slaves there so they could take over the sugar industry. He wanted to find a way that he could make that movie relevant to what was going on in the late 60s, a time of, riots in the streets in the summer, etc. He wound up hanging out with the Black Panthers. So he went from Martin Luther King, who had just been assassinated, to the Black Panthers. He was just, going everywhere he could.
And of course, he sent Sacheen Littlefeather to reject the Oscar that he won.
Yeah.
And to bring awareness to the plight of indigenous and native people in America.
Yeah, and that was all part of his thing. When it came to films, he only wanted to do films that made a difference. I looked at IMDb, which is the listing of all the actors' credits, and Robert De Niro, who is 80 years old, that's how old Brando was when he died, has something like 150 acting credits and counting. Brando had 48. So you think about, the roles that he passed up that he didn't take because he was only taking roles to pay for his extra activities. When he made The Godfather, Paramount didn't want him. He was box office poison, they called him. They wanted Ernest Borgnine or Laurence Olivier to play Don Corleone. But Coppola wanted him.
Could you imagine if Ernest Borgnine had gotten that role?
It would be a little bit of a different
Oh my
film.
God, it's McHale.
Yeah. But the cool thing was, when he got the role, who was he working with? He was working with Al Pacino and Jimmy Caan and John Cazale and Robert Duvall and Talia Shire, and they're like, we're working with Marlon Brando. And so
they knew
he was a giant. And what does Brando do in order to make these people feel comfortable? He engages in mooning contests with them. Through the entire shoot of the Godfather, they were mooning each other from cars, from windows, whatever they could do. And Brando, during that first opening scene of the Godfather, the wedding scene, there were 700 extras in the backyard of this estate in Staten Island. And during a lull in the filming, Brando dropped his pants in front of all the extras. And Jimmy Caan said, "You win. You're the king of the mooners." You did it.
He obviously had kind of a self-destructive streak too. It wasn't just that he was, I mean, I know that he could take or leave acting. He was indifferent to it, although he loved the money that it brought him. But it seemed like he was a little self-destructive. And maybe that emanated from having such a screwed up childhood. We know that he had this philandering father, an alcoholic mother, and a nanny that abused him.
Mm-hmm.
How did you think that impacted his decisions, the way he carried himself?
Well, I mean, he had a very tough childhood. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska, and at the time, his father was a traveling salesman, a philanderer, a drunk. His mother got involved in local theater, and his mother really found her place there in the local theater in Omaha. As a matter of fact, one of her friends had a son who was sort of aimless, and she convinced that mother to let her son get involved in the acting troupe. That was Henry Fonda. She got Henry Fonda involved in acting. She was suddenly uprooted when Brando's father took another job, moved the family to a farmhouse outside Chicago. And so everything the mother had there was gone. The father was never there. And Brando remembers having to, getting phone calls at night and having to pick up his mother at bars or from the side of the road because she was just such a terrible drunk. Again, when he moved to New York, she followed. When he came to Hollywood, his father followed. And he started his own production company to give his father a job. And so it was very interesting. He had that through his life where he was dealing with, his parents, until the end.
What about the story about the nanny that kind of introduced him to sex in an inappropriate way early on?
Yeah, it was one of the first
Sweeping
things,
together, literally sweeping.
One of the first things he writes about in, I guess it was in the interviews he did for Songs My Mother Taught Me, is remembering being about 4 years old, 5 years old, sleeping nude with his 19-year-old governess, the nanny, and how he remembers like her body was mine, she was mine, she was all mine, and then she went and got married and left, and he said, she abandoned me, and that ruined me with women for the rest of my life. It was very interesting. He knew, because Brando, also was a real proponent of psychotherapy and psychiatrists at a time when
that was considered shameful.
It was shameful or a joke, etc. And he took the heat for it. He was very open about it, and it helped a lot in his acting as well.
So did he have? I know that he was really out about his being bisexual.
Mm-hmm.
Did he have? Did the people that he was with? Did he ever out them? Was that ever scandalous? Was it just, oh, that's Marlon? And everybody kind of forgave him for being inappropriate.
No, there were never scandals. I mean, the real scandals he had was with his first wife, Anna Cashby, who he had a very public divorce and custody battles with her that the press really ate up, much as they did, 40 years later with Johnny Depp and his ex-wife. The same sort of thing went on with Brando back in 1960. And again, she was going to the press all the time, saying terrible things about him and the way he lived his life. And that really took away from the activism he was doing. He might have been, on a picket line and have to leave the picket line to go to court in Santa Monica here. And that what made the headlines was what went on in the court. So he had a lot of distractions as far as that went.
He never wanted to be just like a matinee idol. He never wanted to be the guy that, he never wanted to be the star, it seemed. Like the old studio system, they offered him, I'm sure, millions of dollars to do that. He was considered an actor's actor.
Yeah.
He literally perfected and invented and perfected the method. And as you say, he didn't care. He didn't care. This was just something he did between the things he cared about.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can see that. But the most important thing is, even in the 60s, which they call his lost decade, he never phoned it in. He always brought something to a role. I mean, you look at, again, you can talk about the way he played a motorcycle gang leader in The Wild One. Look at Mutiny on the Bounty. I mean, Clark Gable played Fletcher Christian in Mutiny on the Bounty. Mel Gibson played Fletcher Christian, a macho seafaring man who takes over the ship from the captain. Brando played him as like a fop, sort of this strange high class, fellow, and it was bizarre, but it worked. But it was very different. In Morituri, he plays a spy, very much unlike you would expect a spy to be played. He played a Nazi soldier in The Young Lions, where he demanded that he said, "No, I'm not playing it like this. I'm not playing it like we always see Nazis. I want this guy to have a heart and have a soul." So he played like a sympathetic Nazi in The Young Lions, and he always brought that to all of his roles.
Was he trying to screw with people's heads? I mean, or did he? Was this just his creative choice?
Definitely a creative choice. It was his. It was always his goal to bring reality and life to these roles. Before him, actors would have their roles. They'd read their lines. Bogart would read his lines. He was great. He'd read them a certain way. Clark Gable would read his lines. Gary Cooper would read his lines. The next person would read their lines. You see Brando in these films. You see him like in The Men. He's got Jack Webb there and other actors like that. They're reading their lines. And then there's Brando, and he's not reading his lines. He's waiting. He's maybe not saying what he's supposed to be saying, but he's trying to bring a realism to it. And sometimes it conflicted with the other actors on the set, but it really reached its peak, I think, and what it was his greatest role was in Last Tango in Paris.
I was going to say we need to talk about that and the sex scenes, and
Yeah.
I mean, not to get too explicit here. That was the 1972 film. I think he got nominated for an Oscar for that too.
He did too, yeah.
And there was the notorious rape scene with his co-star Maria Schneider, and then
Yeah, that's
supposedly involved actual abuse.
Well, that's
the charge.
That's gotten a lot of publicity just recently. Now, actually, around the time I was writing the book, it first started coming out. I think her sister wrote a book about her. The fact that Brando and the director, they had a scene. Last Tango in Paris is about a man whose wife has just committed suicide. He's grieving. He meets a young woman at an apartment that they're both looking at, and they agree to have a sexual relationship that's totally impersonal, not knowing each other's names. And they just meet in this apartment and have sex and say dirty things to each other. There's a scene in which Brando sodomizes her using butter, and that was the big thing. I remember I saw the film when it came out. I was probably like 16, 17 years old. It's like, oh, we got to see Last Tango. It's rated X. Oh, the butter scene. Whoa. And saw the film. And okay, yeah, I remember that. Then I watch it again 50 years later. And I'm like, oh my God, how could I have had any idea what this film was about? It wasn't about that. That the scene with the butter wasn't the most.
It wasn't germane to the plot.
No, and it wasn't the greatest scene in the film. The scene that got him the Academy Award nomination was a scene where he's sitting in a hotel room with the corpse of his wife, and he's talking to his wife, and he's cursing her, and he's crying to her, and he's apologizing to her. And as it turns out, the director, Bertolucci, didn't speak much English. And he told Brando throughout the film, improvise, just say whatever you want to say. So Brando was taking a lot from his life, what he wanted to say to his mother, what he wanted to say to his father in these scenes, that it was mostly all improvised. And he said, I'm never going to do this again. I'm never going to put myself out like that and take so much of myself out of that. And he never did again. And he went and did Superman,
Wasn't there another scene in Last Tango, though, involving something that Maria did to him?
You're going back to the fact that Brando had a great effect on popular culture and sexuality, not only in the role of the leading man, who went from being this stoic hero to being someone with a lot of self-doubt and a bit of femininity to them. He also, with Last Tango in Paris, I think is the other most influential film as far as popular culture goes. He really changed men's roles in sexuality. Again, there's the scene where, again, he sodomizes her, but then again, that didn't actually happen. That was just a scene. Maria Schneider's big issue was the fact that they sprung it on her. They didn't tell her, we're going to do this. Although apparently it was in the script, but the butter wasn't, and she was upset by that. And later they blamed a lot of what happened later in her life, her drug addiction, etc., on that. But there's another scene after that where, sort of overlooked, where Brando is having her clip her fingernails so she can do the same thing to him. And that's something that men and leading men probably wouldn't, fess up to or want to have in public. And Brando did that. But also was very interesting when Ingmar Bergman, the director, saw the film. He said, "This isn't a film about a man and a woman. This is a film about two men." But they couldn't make a film with two men, so they had to put a woman in the role instead.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, and you look at it, and today, and you look at what, this whole, what do you call it, where you swipe left and swipe right, kind of.
Oh, even the dating app?
The dating apps and stuff. That's sort of what went on in this movie. Gave birth to that sort of thing. Anonymous sex. Move on, get on to the next person, etc. So I think that had a great cultural impact.
He was pretty fearless in that way. He didn't seem to care what the what the fallout was from so many things he did. Was he appreciated in his lifetime to the degree that you think he should have been?
No, even his obituaries when he died, said he was a great actor who kind of threw it away. After he did Last Tango, he did the Missouri Breaks with Jack Nicholson, who would become his neighbor up on Mulholland there. And this is where Brando started to really show his disdain for acting. He's playing a regulator, a hitman out in the Wild West. And he shows up in the film and he's talking in a wild Irish brogue, and a horse rides up and Brando pops up from underneath the horse. And next thing you know, Brando's in drag. And nobody knows why. And the director couldn't control him. Then he does Superman, which again, Brando doing Superman, he became the highest paid actor in Hollywood history for about 7 minutes of screen time in the first film, and they put him in the second film as well. But he did something different. When he played Superman's father, this was that first Superman film, it was a comic book film. And great actors didn't appear in comic book films. This one was a winky, it was a camp film. Gene Hackman was
Before
in it.
the Marvel era.
Yeah, Gene Hackman was in it, Ned Beatty, and they played it like cartoon characters. Brando played the father of Superman as if he was doing Shakespeare. He played it totally straight, and he literally made the world safe for the Marvel universe. He made the world safe for great actors to be in comic book movies, which you see everybody doing now. Brando was the first, and he made it safe to do that. Where later in his career, directors, producers would want to get Brando in their film because then they could attract great talent. You get Brando in your film, you can get De Niro. If you get Brando in your film, you can get Ed Norton.
They all want to work with him.
Yeah, they all wanted to work with Brando. So, at the time, Brando wouldn't bring in the box office, but he'd bring in the actors who would. But then you look what he did. All right, so after he did Superman, he did Apocalypse Now.
All I remember about Apocalypse Now is him like sitting there in the dark saying the horror, and like eating lychee nuts or something.
Yeah, I mean, this is a film. He's reunited with Francis Coppola from The Godfather. When he did The Godfather, one of the people that I speak to in the book is Gray Fredrickson. Gray was the assistant producer on The Godfather. He produced Godfather 2, got the Academy Award for that, and produced Apocalypse. He produced a lot of the other Coppola films. And Gray told me that they're waiting for Brando to show up on the set in the Philippines. He shows up, and he's 300 pounds, and he's got his head shaved, and he hasn't read the novella Heart of Darkness that the thing is based on. And then, what are we going to do with this guy? And, so first of all, Coppola had to bring him down. They were all living on houseboats, had to sit there every morning and read the script and explain everything to Brando. And then they said, well, we have to hide him.
He totally let himself go.
So that's why they put him in the shadows, and he would pop up once in a while in the shadows because they said we had to. We had no choice.
Because he just looked grotesque.
Yeah, and that's what he did as he went on. He did cameos in most pictures after that. He showed up with George C. Scott in The Formula, where he's playing a millionaire industrialist. He shows up. He has plugs in his nose. He shaved his head so he's bald-headed, put things in his cheeks, and he gave himself hearing aids so he could actually have the lines read to him. But his character had all that, and they're like, he doesn't look like Marlon Brando. What's he doing?
So he basically lost his mind as he went along. I know he died at 80.
Yeah.
It sounds like he completely lost his marbles and just didn't care and was doing it for the money. And then God knows why he was doing it.
Well, he was doing it for the money. I mean, he was inventing things. He was he was an inventor. He was paying for the many kids that he had. He was paying for his projects that he had. He owned an island in Tahiti, off Tahiti, an atoll, where again he had started what became the first ecotourism location, as well as doing the ecological experiments there. So he was paying for that. He had upkeep, and he was also channeling money toward his activism activities as well. So,
and didn't he also have to? Wasn't he at least partially supporting his adult children as well?
Yeah, I mean, you think about it. A few years before he died, this was shortly after. This is in 2002, shortly after 9/11. Brando needed money. He didn't have money, and so he would watch QVC. See Joan Rivers on QVC, and somebody said, "You know what you should do? You should sell stuff on QVC. Why don't you do an acting course.
I would have dropped dead on the spot watching Marlon Brando and QVC.
Yeah, well, what he did was he was going to do an acting course. So he rented a studio up in Hollywood, got a stage, put a stage together, invited people from local acting studios, and a bunch of actors. Sean Penn was there, Robin Williams, Whoopi Goldberg, Edward James Olmos, all showed up. And Brando put on a 2-week symposium that he called Lying for a Living. And he came out on stage the first day, dressed as Queen Victoria, weighed about 400 pounds by then.
Jesus.
Came out, sat down, told everyone how acting was just, it's all bull and it's just lying, it's nothing. And then he stood up and he mooned the crowd. They had
that's called losing your mind.
Philippe Petit. Remember the guy that walked the World Trade Towers?
Oh, sure.
He had Philippe Petit show up, and he did some stuff for them. He had they invited homeless people in to come and talk, and Robin Williams would do some improv with the homeless people.
Wow.
Etc. He wound up with all the tapes, tried to edit them into something they could sell on QVC. Couldn't do it, and then he died. And the tapes are still, his estate has them. They said they'll never release them.
Too bad. I would pay to see those.
Yeah, I worked with a producer on one of the reality shows that I did, and he was an actor then. He was there. He said, I was with the Sanford Meisner acting school, and they invited us there. And he goes, I've been taking acting lessons for a few years. And there I am sitting in front of Marlon Brando, the greatest actor of all. And he's telling me that everything I learned was worthless, that it was wrong. This wasn't what acting was about. Anybody can act. His dog could act better than we can act.
And his whole thing was acting was lying.
Acting was lying.
See, it's literally the opposite of where we've gone, Burt. Where we've gone today is you have to be the thing that you're playing.
Right.
There is no lying anymore. You literally have to embody that.
Right.
If you're playing a deaf character, you have to be deaf. If you're playing somebody Latino, you have to be Latino.
Right.
I wonder how Brando would have assessed where his profession went. Or he's still around.
I mean, you looked at where he played, a Japanese man in Tea House of the August Moon. If you remember that, I'm not sure what he played in The Island of Dr. Moreau. That's probably where Brando was at his wildest, where he played Dr. Moreau, where they had a little person on the set. This is where he played a man that was breeding crossbreeds between animals and humans on this island, and all these actors were dressed up as half animal, half human, or whatever. And there was a little person, probably about 2 feet tall. And Brando said, "I want him to be with me in every scene, dressed like me, looking exactly like me."
Mini me.
That's where Mini Me came from. There wouldn't be a Mini Me if not for Marlon Brando.
Wow?
That's what Mike Myers was imitating from that film.
So much the man influenced. If we can go back to The Wild One again, as you had mentioned when we started, there was no such thing as biker flicks.
Right.
This all came from that, because we always think from the 60s and biker flicks that they just sprang from the firmament. They were always there.
Yeah.
But they weren't. He gave rise to all of them.
Yeah. In the 50s, when they first started making youth pictures, it was American International Pictures, who Roger Corman worked with, who later did the biker flicks. First, it was hot rod movies, and they had a hot rod movie called, I think, Drag Strip Girls, and it worked so well they redid the film with motorcycle people instead of dragsters. And you would see in all these films a motorcycle gang, and they all looked like Brando. They all wore the Brando drag. They all had the jeans and the leather jacket. It wasn't until the 60s that, I guess it was called Wild Angels, that Roger Corman saw a picture in Life magazine of a Hells Angels funeral, just as The Wild One was based on a picture in Life magazine of a motorcycle riot in Hollister, California. He went to AIP and said, "We're going to make this movie. What it's going to be? It's going to be a Western, but with motorcycles." And that's really what The Wild One was. As a matter of fact, The Wild One, the head of Columbia Pictures was, in order to cut the budget, refused to let them shoot on location. They shot on a Wild West set on the Columbia Ranch. That's why, if you look at The Wild One, the streets aren't paved. And you could hitch your horse to the hitching post there.
Did he do any traditional Westerns?
he did a number of them. The one film he directed was One-Eyed Jacks.
Oh, that's right.
That was the first film from his production company. And originally, Stanley Kubrick was supposed to direct it. He was going to star in it. He and Kubrick spent a lot of time going over the script and working. They didn't get along. He fired Kubrick and said, "I'll direct it." And so this was going to be a film that, again, he wanted it to point to Native Americans and to help the Native Americans, etc. Film didn't do that at all. Interestingly enough, it was Brando's character is searching for his former, one of his former partners who left him for dead, named Dad. And he spends the entire film trying to find Dad so he can kill Dad. Dad was running his production company, his real dad. So you kind of wonder if it had a lot more to do with his psychotherapy than it did with the Native Americans.
There's just so much surrounding him that seems surreal. His whole career, his whole life was surreal, which I imagine was partly purposeful, that he really wanted to surround himself with this oddness and peculiarity.
Yeah.
You know, and
I mean, you look at him; he was a beautiful looking man. When he was on stage on a streetcar,
the
named Desire,
ultimate.
It was pure sex.
In the 50s, oh my God!
I mean, when he was on stage, the T-shirts were deliberately made a size too small so he could be bulging from them. When he went on stage, everybody else is reading their lines. He is being so natural. If he had a cough, his character coughed. If he had a cold, his character had a cold. If he had to scratch himself, he'd scratch himself. People didn't see this on stage before, and he brought this same look to the films. But the more he worked, the less he cared about himself and about the films. They said that it was during The Wild One where he was so disappointed that the film was not living up to his expectations. That's when he started to overeat and start, chowing down on cake and stuff in between takes. And you look what he did to himself in the end. It's like,
that's a problem if you're an actor. There's always so much craft services stuff nearby.
Yeah,
you could eat yourself to death.
Yeah.
I wonder, should we see if there are any questions from the audience here?
Watch. Sorry. Time? Good.
Do we have any questions about Brando? We have the expert here. Yes.
Not about Brando specifically, but what was your research process for this? Like, how much was in-person interviews versus archives?
It's a combination of a little bit of everything. A lot of in-person interviews. I tried to find people to interview for this book who weren't the standard people that you would go toward. I looked online and found people who had written about Brando, and one guy was, I think, 23 years old and wrote very eloquently about Brando in The Godfather and Brando in the Superman films. A young critic. I found gay critics who wrote about Brando in The Wild One and his other films, as well as some of the usual suspects. I was lucky enough. I've done a lot of documentaries. I co-wrote and produced one feature film. It was a comedy starring Burt Reynolds called Cloud 9, where Burt Reynolds played the coach of an all-stripper beach volleyball team. We'll just leave that out. But one of my co-writers and co-producer was Albert S. Ruddy, who just died this past week. He produced The Godfather, and the executive producer was Gray Fredrickson, who again got the Academy Award for Godfather 2. For a number of years, I worked with Al and worked with Gray, and so I was able to call upon them. Gray was a great source for the book, a resource about Brando. He knew Brando. He worked with Brando on Candy. He worked from the 60s on, and Al had told us a lot of Brando stories. Gray actually died during the research process of the book, and then it was a matter of I'm not a cinema expert. It was a matter of watching every Marlon Brando film and just, being surprised and blown away by all of them. I got to just add one thing about a movie that surprised me. One of my favorite Brando films now. It's called Bedtime Story. It's from 1964. It was co-written by Paul Henning, who created Green Acres. So you can't go
wrong.
Beverly
Hillbillies.
Beverly Hillbillies. You can't go wrong with
right.
that. Brando plays a serviceman in Europe who is a con man and he's also a Lothario. He's able to con women by going up to them and saying, "Oh, my grandmother lived in this house," and he thinks he's like the hottest con man. He manages to get out of the army. He's on a train, and he meets this guy on a train who seems to be a milk toasty character, played by David Niven. Turns out David Niven is a con man. He's a fake prince on the French Riviera who cons women out of love and jewels and money. Well, the two of them team up, and then they become rivals, and they go after women. They have one woman they use as a target. It's sort of a game, etc. Anyway, Brando plays this role. It's like a Jerry Lewis movie. He's doing wild comedy. He's doing slapstick. He's hilarious in this film. And Brando, and the critics at the time said, Brando always surprises us. He is great. This movie really works. They thought it was great. Well, fast forward about 22 years. People forget about the film. And there's another movie that comes out, and it's called Dirty Rotten Scoundrels with Steve Martin and Michael Caine. It's the same picture. And I watched Bedtime Story. Then I watched Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. Then I watched them at the same time, cutting back and forth. And some of the scenes and some of the shots are exactly the same. And Steve Martin is doing Brando, doing Jerry Lewis. And of course, it's in the 80s, so they're doing 80s humor where they're referencing like Dance Fever and doing bathroom jokes, and Steve Martin gets time to do his shtick. But I think that Brando's film is funnier and better than Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. So it's worth checking.
You mentioned that he mumbled some of his, that Young Lions. I was looking at it on YouTube.
Oh, sorry.
In there, he really mumbles. It's funny. He's doing a German accent.
Right.
And it's funny because he doesn't know how to, he doesn't know how to
Right.
speak German, and he just, And this that other movie, I can't think the title of it, but it was just a sensation in Europe. It came out first in Long Lines. What's that movie? I'm getting at the girl in the movie where supposedly they were supposed to have a sex scene.
Oh, Last Tango in Paris.
What?
Is it Last Tango in Paris?
Yeah. Well, I don't know where I got, you read it in
Mhm.
the newspaper or something. He actually penetrated her, from what I understand. Later on, she suicided, and they put it together.
Yeah, it was.
She was so ashamed about it.
Yeah. Actually, no, he didn't actually penetrate her, but they said that she was very upset because he had the whole butter thing and surprised her and got on top of her, etc.
But I can't hear.
Oh, he was saying actually that she wasn't prepared for the scene, that he was going to do that to her with the butter, etc. But he didn't actually penetrate her in
How
that.
do you know?
That's what they. No, that's the story is
Then
from.
there's the other story.
Sorry, let me turn this off. I'm saying, how do I turn this off totally? Sorry, give me a second.
That's okay.
There. Well, maybe he did. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I also saw the Young Lions recently. And another thing I noticed, you notice him mumbling. I noticed him in a lot of scenes. Before he would do a line, he would look up, or he'd look over here. That's where they had written the lines for him, because he had cue cards everywhere.
Did he always have the cue cards?
Yeah, and that wasn't a laziness thing. That was a deliberate technique that he had. Because when people talk, somebody says something to you, you don't come right out and give it a reply. He wanted to hear the line fresh. He wanted to see it fresh, think about it for a second before he spoke. And again, he was lazy in a lot of ways, but this was a deliberate technique that he had, and it came out in his roles. Yeah.
What about Indiana Bounty? Comparing him to who's the other guy that did it before?
Clark Gable, Errol Flynn, Mel Gibson did it later.
The English guy is fantastic. Charles Lawton.
Charles Lawton, the original, yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
In that movie, you were talking about Marlon Brando.
Yeah.
Comparing it, I don't remember Marlon Brando much in that. I saw the movie, but Charles Lawton, I just want to see more of him. He's very,
Yeah.
very
What was his mumbling about? Was that a creative choice too?
Yeah, he said he thought he said, sometimes people mumble, and he wanted to bring a reality to things, so he didn't always want to be declaiming things, and so he'd mumble. I think part of it was it was the way he acted on stage in comparison to the other actors. Whoops! Oh boy, Brando's here. Uh-oh.
Marlon,
See what you
is that
started?
you?
See what you started? Uh-oh. Sorry, dude.
Did you watch The Godfather a few times while you were for inspiration? Do you believe that it's the greatest American film ever made?
From watching it again, no, I don't believe it's Brando's greatest film. I think he
What
did
is his
better.
greatest film?
I think the two films that are the best are Burn, it was really called Queimada, and Last Tango. I think those are his two greatest. I mean, the Godfather was a great film, a great script. He's not in it all that much compared to to the other actors, but it was his great comeback. I mean, Gray Fredrickson told me when Brando showed up on the set, he was buff. He was 47 years old in great shape, and they're like, how can this guy be Don Corleone? Then he puts the stuff in his cheeks. Then he puts in the dental plate. Then he puts on the padding. Then he gets into the look, and suddenly he turned himself into Don Corleone. So it was a great work there.
That's true that he wasn't in it. He was time-wise.
Yeah,
he wasn't in it nearly as much as most of the other guys.
but he was the
focal
core,
point,
the core of the film. Yeah,
and we still, we'll give him an offer he can't refuse.
Yeah.
Just saying that line alone. What do you think his enduring legacy is today? I mean, some people think of him as a joke. Some people think of him as the ultimate artiste. And others sadly don't know who he is today. The current younger generation never heard of him.
I spoke to Gray Fredrickson. Gray, after he retired from Hollywood, went back to Oklahoma City, where he was from, started up a theater department, a film department at the local college. And he became, the head of the department. He had the kids making pictures. He would be lecturer. He was a professor there. And I said, what are these kids? What's it like when you say to these kids, I worked on The Godfather. I worked with Marlon Brando. And he said, they never heard of him. A third of them maybe knew what The Godfather was. And that's where we're at.
Yeah. And The Godfather, his jaws, I guess they call it. I heard he put marbles in there.
Yeah, he put something in his cheeks. Yeah.
And what do you? I have, I kind of just glossed over the film, but there's one scene in there that I'm still thinking about. It's fantastic. He's in the rose garden, and the fly. There's a fly. I don't think it's a bee, but there's a fly in the scene where he's in the rose garden. You can't get that, man.
Well, how about the opening scene with the cat on his lap? The cat wasn't supposed to be in the scene. It kind of crawled up and sat on Brando's lap. And Brando insisted on keeping the cat there. And the cat just stayed there through the whole scene. They had to redouble all his lines because the cat was making so much noise.
So if you remember, it was like a warm, sunny day.
Yeah.
And he's talking. And the roses are on the left, where his right arm. And this fly comes and is buzzing around.
I'm going to watch it again when I get back now
You
to see that.
You never see that.
Yeah.
Should we do one more question, or you could do?
Oh, yeah.
Any,
Sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to mention my friend, Nick, perhaps you know her, Avra Douglas. She was his assistant since 1990, and she runs his estate. I told her to come tonight, and she completely forgot.
Ah.
I just texted her, and she said, say hi for me. And
Go.
she forgot.
Oh.
But I told her we should come and meet with you.
I'll send her my best.
I will.
Any final thoughts, Burt?
But I just wanted to mention that I learned more from you than I learned from her.
Oh, geez. Well,
Just curious, what about the Tea House of the August Moon? That was kind of an odd role for Brando. It was kind of,
it was
almost a comedic role.
it was comedic, and it was yellow face, right? I mean, it's stuff that you wouldn't do
that.
today. You can't do that. And it was a comedic role. It was a funny role. It was a very odd role for Brando to play.
be like Mickey Rooney and Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Oh, geez, not as bad as that.
Not quite. A more creative version.
Yeah, it was not a bad film, but a very strange part for Brando to take.
Very, very, just almost laughable.
Yeah,
Yeah, he played Guys and Dolls too.
that's another thing too. Yeah, I mean Frank Sinatra couldn't stand the fact that Brando was playing Sky Masterson in Guys and Dolls, because Brando couldn't sing. Sinatra played Nathan Detroit, had like the secondary role. They wrote some extra songs for Brando, for Sinatra, but it turned out that Sinatra really hated Brando even more because of On the Waterfront. You know, Elia Kazan wanted Brando to be in On the Waterfront. Brando didn't want to work with Kazan again because Kazan had testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee and named names, right? So Sam Spiegel, the producer, signed Frank Sinatra, contract and everything, signed him to star On the Waterfront. But when he got Brando, tore up the contract, and Sinatra wound up suing over it.
What is it? What's the name of the guy that directed that movie On the Waterfront?
Elia Kazan.
Yeah, and he had named names, and I think I read his obit. He wasn't ashamed of it.
No.
He you know, it's like transparency in America. You know, where are you at?
Yeah, and that's what On the Waterfront was about. Really, it was about, you know, the squealer. And Brando said he didn't realize when he was making the film that's what it was about. But it seemed to be pretty obvious. You know, they were glorifying the guy who stood up against in this case, it was the mob.
Yeah. I think that's a good place for us to wrap. Burt
Thank you,
Kearns.
Ray. What do you have coming up? Ray, what books do you have coming up?
I have the complete visual history of The Sopranos coming out in the TV show in October. So, but thank you,
Thanks,
Burt.
guys.
Thank you, Burt.
Thanks,
Marlon
everybody, for
Brando,
coming.
Hollywood
Thank you so
Rebel.
much.
Please buy it.
I'm sorry, I was pointed. My chair's pointed this way.
And Marlon threw a book at me during our talk.
Yeah, that was.
That was